We are glad you're here. My name's Jeremy. I'm the lead pastor of The Journey. And we have been going through this book, the Gospel of Luke, the third book of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the series has been especially challenging and powerful for me, and I hope for you, and partly because it has challenged, give me fresh eyes to really see again what Jesus really did, fresh ears to really hear again what he really said, because when you really listen to what Jesus says and really see what he really does, you ought to be a little bit shocked. Did we hear what was read in the scripture? Sometimes I think we run the Bible through this non-reality filter, like a fairy tale Disney World filter or something like that. But these are two stories, miraculous stories, healing stories, right? The first one is a centurion and his servant. And it says Jesus healed this man on his deathbed without even going there. And the next one is even crazier. It says that Jesus raise this dude up from the dead. And see, if we're listening, we ought to be there should be some people in here I don't buy that. I'm not going to get on that. Do you really believe that? You should be asking, you should at some time question our sanity or our recreational drug use or something like that, because these stories are crazy. So it's a perfectly logical question. Do you really believe that? Because this whole thing is shocking. Listen, it's shocking in a lot of ways. Because, I can say partly because of where and how I grew up, and partly because I've been a pastor. There have been times when I have had to be or been alone in a room or alone in a building with a dead body. And it's a little, it's a little spooky. So you're in the movie Get Out, just like a chill, a chill's going through your body here. And so when you're in that space, when you're in a room like that or a building like that, you know what you don't want to happen? Verse 15. That's what you don't want. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. That's what you're praying against. See, the stories ought to shock at some level. And so we ought to be asking, is this a true story or a fairy tale? What do you really believe this, or what's really happening here? Some of us, that's maybe not our question. Some of us are maybe thinking okay, well, what kinds of things does God heal, and why does he heal, and why does he heal some people, not others, and how does that all work? Some of us look at this and maybe I don't have any problem believing it happened here, but what about now? Does this still happen now? What's going on now? Does Jesus work in this way? What do you say about that? All great questions that we're going to try to uncover and walk through. And so in order to do that, I'm not going to go verse by verse like I typically do. We'll take a little broader lens, because the first thing I want us to see about this story is who Jesus heals. What kind of person would Jesus actually heal? Who is it? And you might be saying, well, why are you taking the two stories together? Two different stories, two different people, two different healings on two different days. Why don't you preach, centurion this week, and we'll do widow and the son next week? Well, one, Luke is a long book. I'm trying to speed this series up a little bit, trying to get us moving. But in reality, it is because I believe Luke puts them together for a reason. He puts them next to each other because he wants us to see them together and do the, when you're a kid, you compare and contrast, and that's how you make, learn things and all that kind of stuff. Because all the way through the Gospel of Luke, when you start to read it, you'll notice he puts pairs of people together. Everywhere you see, he's presenting a pair of people and going, what's different about them, right? You go to chapter 1, Mary and Elizabeth. Chapter 2, Simeon and Anna. Chapter 5, there's a leper and a paralytic. We get to the end of this chapter next week, there's a religious man and a prostituting woman. Get to chapter 11, Mary and Martha. Chapter 15, an older brother and a younger brother. Chapter 16, Lazarus, the poor man, and the rich man. Chapter 18, the Pharisee and the tax collector. It goes on and on. Why? Because he wants us to see them together. Who are these two people? A Roman centurion and a Jewish widow. Look at the differences between these two people. Let's compare and contrast. What do you got? You got one, a man and a woman. And in our day, we go, we know men and women are different. We make little jokes or whatever. But in this day, women were considered second-class citizens, property. Like you didn't have a choice who you're going to marry, what you're going to do. You didn't get to testify in court, own property. Like it was. If you were a man, you didn't even talk to a woman unless she was your wife. Like that was how crazy it was. So he's a man, she's a woman. He's prosperous and she's poor. How do we know he's prosperous? Look at verse 4. Verse 4. The centurion has a servant, right? And back to verse 2, it says the servant was highly valued by him. That word actually means precious. In other words, this is not just some guy that works for him. This is like his own son. In fact, in verse 7, he calls him child. And he sends some messengers, some Jewish elders from the synagogue to ask Jesus, can you come and heal this person? Verse 3, when the centurion heard about Jesus, by the way, he heard about Jesus. That means somebody had to tell him, just like someone told me and someone told you. Who are you telling? Who are you telling about the work and the person of Christ? Verse 4 comes, says, when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him. He loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. In other words, this Roman centurion was wealthy, and he paid for the synagogue to be built. Their building was built like his name was up on the front, right? Like he was the generous donor that provided this facility. He's prosperous and she's poor. How do we know she's poor? Verse 12. Behold, there was a man who died, being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. She was a widow. She had no husband. She had no son. And in that day, like there's not a government program. There's no welfare or WIC. There's no, government cheese coming. There's no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. None of that's going to happen. She is going to be completely destitute and dependent on charity for the rest of her life. This man is a Roman centurion, so he's a Gentile. She is a Jew. She's part of the racial, religious minority of the day. He's majority culture. She is minority culture. He's a soldier. He's strong, and she is a weeping widow and weak. He has authority. He's got servants. He's sending friends and people in and out, or whatever. She is vulnerable. She is walking by herself in the funeral procession of her only son. These two people could not be any more different than night and day. Why does Luke put them together? Because what he's saying is there's only one thing that could bring people this different together. Only Jesus. Only Jesus can do that. And if we start to think about, well, what's the modern day equivalent? Think about the difference. Like this is like Republican and Democrat. This is like hipster and housewife. This is city and county and north of Del Mar and south of Del Mar. He's a centurion, right? He's stationed there. This is like a police officer and a protester. This is like Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. And what can bring all those different kind of people and things together? Only the gospel can do that. But it has the power. Jesus has the power. What does he do? He goes to them both. He loves them both. He he saves and heals them both. And to think about how crazy that is. Think about how different that is. It's a totally different approach to the whole culture, the whole world. Because immediately, like, what does our culture do? Our culture is always trying to label cats, right? Like label people, categorize, divide, and you're this and you're that. And as soon as you say you're for something over here, you automatically, well, you must be anti this. And everybody tries to separate, right? And Jesus goes, no, I have a whole different approach. I can be both pro-man and pro-woman. I can be both pro-prosperity and pro-poor. I can be pro-Gentile and pro-Jew because his whole approach, he's not saying, oh, well, Jesus did these miracles, therefore he approves of everything these people ever did. He approves of everything all Roman centurions ever did somewhere. He is saying my approach is I begin not by labeling people, not by lighting them up on social media, not by going after them and assuming that if they believe that, they must be against over here. He approaches them, he approaches people with mercy, love, grace, and healing. That's his starting place. Is that your starting place? Are you just accepting the categories that the world gives us? Or are you letting Jesus blow those categories out of the water? That's what we want. If we say we want to engage culture, Is that our beginning spot? Or do we start with anti and condemnation and all those kinds of things? See, Anne Lamott, she said it really well. I like her writing a lot, and she said this: you can safely assume that you have created God in your image when God hates all the same people that you do. Once you have a God and he checks off all the boxes you check off, like, oh, yep, he agrees with me politically and socially and all the people, you done made that God up. He doesn't exist. He's in your mind, in your imagination. And the point is, the gospel, Jesus Christ, brings a third way. We don't have to accept all the categories that the world tries to place us in and label us with. We can hear the gospel. We can approach people of all kinds of difference, background, race, religion, creed, immorality, morality, the love and the mercy of Christ. That's what he does. He approaches them with healing. Now, a lot of you are saying, well, is that the moral of the story? Like, that's pretty, okay, I can roll with that. That's pretty dope. I like the story on that. Like, that sounds good. Or are you saying this really happened? Like, he really healed some people? Well, you read Luke, and Luke's right. He's not writing a fairy tale. He's not writing Aesop's fables. He's writing history. So he's making the claim that it actually happened. So you're like, are you telling me as a 21st century person who knows about science, like, you believe this actually happened? And maybe you might be thinking sort of like, well, you know what? I could get on board with like the first one, like the centurion, because look at verse 10. Verse 10, when those who had been sent to Jesus, when they returned to the house, they found the servant well. Like, Luke's implying that Jesus healed him, right? But maybe the dude just got better. Like, maybe sometimes people get sick and then they get better. Likely not happening that fast, you know what I mean? But like, maybe his immune system kicked in. Maybe some people came along to help him. Like, he was about to die, and somebody came along and rubbed some Vicks Vapor Rub on his chest, and it just lightened him right up. Some of you guys still use that. Like, when I was growing up, like, there were only 3 medications in our home. The first one was Dimetap, and I don't even know if they make that anymore. It's basically the equivalent of a placebo effect. It does nothing. But as a kid, like, you would love Dimetap because it tastes like grape candy. So it don't do anything, but at least it tastes good. And you didn't have to drink the second medicine in our house, which was Robitussin. Robitussin tastes nasty. It's terrible. Remember that old Chris Rock bit when he's like, just pour some tussin on it, whatever it is, right? And the third thing we had was Vicks Vapor Rub, and this was a cure-all. Like, you had a cold, a flu, sinuses, congestion. My little brother legitimately had asthma. Like, rub some Vapor Rub on his chest. He'll be good. Sleeplessness, put it on your feet. Like, I mean, literally, and it just lights up the house. I mean, you ever smell this stuff? Whatever ailed you broke your leg in a tractor accident, just rub some Vapor Rub in there. And so you can look at this and go like, well, maybe, somebody came along with the Vapor Rub of that day and they just kind of revived him, But when you get to the other one, it's like, what? Because people do get sick and just get better, right? It just happens sometimes. You know what no one ever does? Dies and gets better. That never happens. But verse 14, Jesus says to the man, he walks up to this casket and says, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. Are you telling me you believe that happened? Maybe you would say, well, there's got to be a logical explanation, right? What are a couple things you could think? Well, you might say, maybe this guy wasn't really dead. Like, maybe he just sort of out and his breathing was shallow. He kind of slipped into a coma or something, and they thought he was dead. Well, number one, like, people don't just pop up out of a coma, like, start talking and walking around. It takes a little more time than that if it happens. But two, they handle dead bodies differently. Like, we, dress people up in their, Sunday best or whatever, but in that day, they wrapped you in grave clothes and cloth, and that was like mummy, like head to toe. So he would have had all this cloth on his face, and which means like he would not have been able to breathe. So even if he wasn't dead, when they wrapped him up, he was dead by the time he got to Jesus, because he'd been like several hours without any oxygen. And you go, okay, well, maybe Luke just made all this up. Like, he wants people to believe and all that kind of stuff. Maybe he just made it up. Let me tell you why I think that's almost impossible. Number one, Luke himself was a physician. He was a doctor. Luke knew all about death. It's like, well, they don't understand. People were so gullible back then. They'll just believe anything. They didn't know about science. He didn't know about molecular biology. He didn't know about DNA. He knew about death. They experienced death at a far higher rate than you and I do today. They experienced it with animals. The childhood mortality rate was like 50%. I mean, they saw it all the time. They might not have understood DNA. They understood death and when someone was dead. And they understood that when you die, you didn't get up and start talking again. That didn't happen. Luke was a physician and a doctor, and he was a skeptic. Remember before he became a Christian? I talked about this in the intro sermon. He was looking for reasons not to believe this stuff, and he found out that in fact, the evidence was there, and he had to believe it. The second reason is in verse 11. It says, soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain. What is Nain? Nain is a small town 5 miles south of where Jesus grew up. If you're making a story up, you are not going to place it in Nain, 5 miles south of where Jesus grew up. It's a small town. I grew up in a small town. Some of you did, or maybe you grew up in like a tight community or block or apartment complex or whatever. And you know what happens in small towns, right? In small towns, everybody knows your business. Everybody talks about your business. Everybody knows everything that's going on. And in small towns, nothing exciting ever happens. And if it does, they remember it and talk about it forever. People just remember stuff, right? I haven't lived in South Carolina for 20 years. And I go home, folks remember stuff I had forgot. It just comes up, and oh, hey, Jeremy, good to see you again. Remember that time, June of 91, and you came over to go fishing, and you caught 13 catfish in our pond. No, I had forgot that, actually. You're holding on to that memory, huh? It's been a slow quarter century for you. Not a lot happens in small towns, but if it does, they remember it. You know about it. And it's like, you're going to remember some catfish? You're not going to remember some dude getting raised from the dead? This is a small town. Small town, everybody knows what's going on. Everybody talks, right? Everybody gossips around it. You know how it kind of reminds me of, if you ever watched a long time ago, In Living Color, you remember Kim Wayans' character, and she would always tell everything going on in the community. She would talk smack on everybody, and then at the end, she would always say, but I ain't one to gossip, so you ain't heard that from me, right? That's how small towns operate. And so you can bet that this would have been the talk of the town, forever and ever. And see, the Bible's written too early to be fabricated. This is not written 200 years after Jesus died. This is written like 25 years after Jesus died. And if Luke was going to make it up, he's not going to put it in Nain. He would have just said, hey, somewhere at some time in some place there was some dude that Jesus raised from the dead. And make it totally non-specific. But when you make it so specific, and it was at the gate, and it was with the procession, it was this one widow who had only one son, and Jesus came, and it was in this particular town at that particular moment, then if it didn't really happen, then all these people, that whole town's be coming out, nope, that never happened. We never saw it. They're going to be attacking this from the beginning. Luke can only say it because he actually happened. And so if you start to really look at the evidence, look at the logic and the reason behind it, and especially if you start to get to Jesus' resurrection, for which there's an ungodly amount of evidence, I guess you say a godly amount of evidence, but there's a lot. Here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that it will take you far more faith to disbelieve than to believe. It'll actually take you far more faith to disbelieve than to believe. And see, some of you are starting to ask those questions right now, like, wait a minute, is this plausible? And a lot of times it takes an interruption in your life. See, their life was interrupted. Like, Centurion, his life's going well. All of a sudden, his friend gets sick. This woman's life is going well, then her husband passed away, her son passed away. These interruptions come. Something that interrupts your sleep, something that interrupts your plans, something that interrupts your life, something that interrupts your career advancement, something that interrupts your schooling, something that interrupts. Is there anything interrupting your life right now? Maybe it's not creating, but it's revealing your need for Jesus and to call on him. That's what happens here. It's shocking that this is the kind of healing that Jesus just walks up and does. You go, okay, well, why did he do it? Well, we think we know because we think we know how every other system in the world works and every religion. Verse 4, this is how they thought about it, right? They come and they say, Jesus, this man is worthy to have you do this for him. He loves our nation. He's the one that built us our synagogue. He's a good man. He's worthy. He loves our nation. He's pro-Israel. He built us our synagogue. He's generous. We would say, and he's been living with this minority community, and they've friends and learn, like we would say in our day, like this man is woke, right? He understands stuff, and he's a good guy, and they say he's worthy, and the guy corrects them later, says, no, that's not why. That's not how the gospel works. Verse 6. The centurion's like, oh, they probably messed this up. And he sends some other friends out to say, Jesus, don't trouble yourself. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. The great thing about the gospel is you don't have to be worthy. In fact, that's the only requirement there is. That Jesus saves and he heals, not because you were worthy. Not because you were good, but because he is. That's what we believe. That's what the gospel says. If God does anything, it's not because you were smart enough or worthy enough, not because you signed a card or prayed a prayer magically or walked an aisle or because your mom and daddy did something or you went to church and you volunteered, you gave money, you were working it's not because of any of those things, because of what Jesus did. Your worthiness can't save you. Your sincerity can't save you. Even your faith cannot save you. Jesus saves you through faith. Jesus saves. That's what he does, and he does it because he is good, he is merciful, he is compassionate. That's what he does. And look, it's not because they have their theology right. This widow, she doesn't ask for anything. Jesus just comes up. The dude here, the centurion, verse 8, he goes, well, Jesus, I understand because I'm a man under authority, just like you're under authority. And in other words, like, you're tight with God, but you're not God himself. And, Jesus is not like, you don't even understand the Trinity. Can't be coming to your house doing any healing. Like, see, the approach, Jesus approaches, he begins with relationship and love and mercy and grace and healing. He'll fix all that other stuff along the way. It's not saying it's not important, but it's not primary. What does he heal? Look at all the different kinds of things he heals. Because sometimes we get in church and we get spiritual mode, because this is shocking too. And here's where I think, listen, we're good at reading stories like this. We might even be good at believing them, but we're not usually good at entering them. We're not usually good at applying them to ourselves and believing of what God can actually do and his power, right? Look at all the things, the different categories. Because Jesus, the gospel comes, a whole gospel for the whole person, for the whole world. It's holistic. It's physical, spiritual, social, emotional, relational, economic, like all the way through, right? Physical, we see like sickness is healed and this guy's raised from the dead. It's also spiritual. See verse 9? It says, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and he said, I have not even in Israel found such faith as this. Like, this is the only time in the Bible Jesus ever said to marvel at someone's great faith. I mean, you made the Son of God marvel at you. That's pretty high praise, right? So it's physical, it's spiritual, it's social. Verse 16 to 17 says, this spread out through all of Judea and the surrounding country. It was transformational for the city, transformational for their community. It said, you know what? We can be a place that gets transformed by the love of Jesus. We can have hope for our community, our city, because Jesus can bring together two totally disparate, different kinds of people. It's social, it's emotional. So emotional healing. Look at verse 13. A lot of us times we mess something up, or we're broken, or we're like, I guess God just thinks I'm a loser. He looks at me and shakes his head. Verse 13 says, but when the Lord saw her, he had compassion. And he said, don't weep. He looks at you with compassion. He looks at you with love. It's an emotional healing. It's relational. Maybe the sweetest verse in the whole thing is verse 15. The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Gave him back. He restored the body, but he restored the relationship. It's multifaceted, and it's important because we are holistic people. And a lot of times we come to church, we're like, I'm doing spiritual, a little emotional, whatever. But God made us physical creatures, and he's saying all these things actually have to work for you have to think about yourself and know yourself as physical and emotional and social and relational, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, you know this in the real world. Like, sometimes it's why do you have trouble concentrating and focusing at work or whatever? Well, because your body's out of shape and you're eating terrible or whatever, so it just messes everything else up, messes you mentally up. Or if you've been married for any amount of time that you are not going to have an amazing sex life based on pure physical things. It doesn't matter. I don't care how hot you are and how much stamina and technique and how many Cosmo articles you've read about it. It's not going to be on that. It's got to be relational and emotional and spiritual and mental. Like, all that stuff's gotta work. And sometimes we mix it up, because just like very practically, here's what happens sometimes. Sometimes things that seem like an emotional or spiritual problem are really a physical one, or vice versa. Let's give you an example. Now, sometimes like a couple will come to me and talk and say, you know what, we had a great marriage and everything's going well. It's about 2 months ago, and all of a sudden we're not communicating, we're fighting, we're short and angry, and calling each other names and everything. And before I would have been just only thinking spiritually, right? Oh, what's happening? Are you reading your Bible? Are you praying? You're looking at porn? You got an emotional affair happening? Like, what are all the things here? You know where I start with something like that now? You guys trying a Whole30 diet? You guys working, trying to do South Beach? You've been trying to give up caffeine for the last couple months? Perhaps we've located the issue. It may not be a relational problem. Maybe you just need to eat a sandwich. You just need some food. You need that caffeine. We're not Mormon. You can go for it. And you spend all this time trying to work on your marriage, and you just need to eat something. Or a lot of times people say, man, I've been so sad lately. I've been like hopeless and whatever. I'm like, what time are you going to bed? Oh, well, I've only been sleeping about 3 hours a night. Probably one of the big conditions causing that. I've had couples before. They go to pastors or counselors or whatever, and they like work on their sex life is broken, nothing's working, whatever. Turned out after like 2 years of frustration, not getting anywhere and all that, it was all like a medical issue. And so, like, we're holistic people. Jesus brings holistic healing, right? It works the other way too. Sometimes something that presents physical is actually emotional, relational, spiritual. The Bible talks about this several places. Psalm 32, 1 Corinthians 11. This happened to me several years ago. I was just woke up one day with crazy stomach pain, like incredible, like literally just get in a fetal position and lay down and can't do anything, stomach pain. And of course, after a while, I just kept going on. Like after a few weeks, and I went to the doctor. I went to every specialist in St. Louis. I had every blood work and panels done. I went and, you ever got to go and drink that white barium, I think it is, and it just is, some Vicks Vapor Rub in that moment, it was, that didn't work. So you had to drink that barium, and they x-ray you, and then another time they put me to sleep, endoscopy, and put a scope down, and just, after months and months, they were like, you're in perfect health. There's no thing to look at here. And then somebody said, well, maybe it's a spiritual thing. Maybe it's a spiritual attack or some kind of thing. So we started praying. About a week later, I just woke up one day and it was gone. Never came again. Now, you might say, well, it's a coincidence. You might think I'm crazy. You won't be the first person to say it. Or maybe Jesus is a God who heals. And you say, well, if that's true, then why this and not that? Why this person and not that person? Why this timing and not that timing? Why does it happen over here and not here? Why for the answer? I don't know. If I knew, I would be God. Newsflash, I'm not him. He's sovereign and all-knowing. I'm not. So I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that Jesus saves, Jesus restores, Jesus redeems, Jesus heals, and he does it emotionally and spiritually and socially and physically in all kinds of different ways. I can't tell you exactly when and who and how and all that kind of stuff. I can just tell you that it happens, that I've seen it, that I've experienced it. And so he's saying, listen, are we willing to ask him? Are we willing to ask him to heal? And I'm not talking about little, we have our little qualified, caveated prayers. Lord, I know you just don't really think much of this, and maybe, that's not really in your will at all, but if you could perhaps give me some time. And no, verse 7, he just asked boldly. What does he say in verse 7? In verse 7, he says, just say the word, Lord, and let it happen. He just asked boldly. Why? Because we're supposed to be like little kids with our father, with a good father. Little kids, they don't have filters. You've been around little kids? They don't have any filters. They just all the time like, mama, 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 daddy, daddy, can we do this? Can we do this? And they just ask anything, whatever's in their mind, whatever's in their heart, they just ask it. And it could be annoying for us at times, but it's not annoying like that to God. He wants us to ask. He wants us to come. Jesus says, ask and receive. Knock on the door and I'll open it for you, right? He wants us to come like little kids. And here's what I figured out is that when my kids ask me for some crazy thing, some huge thing that I couldn't possibly pull off, that is not an insult. That's a compliment. And we're like, well, don't you know that's not possible? It's like, no, listen. When my kids are like, Dad, can we move to Hawaii and live on the beach in a huge mansion? I'm like, can't pull that off. But what they're saying is, they think I could when they ask. My dad seems like the guy that has the kind of resources to do this. And we serve a God in heaven that actually has every resource at his disposal. And we're afraid to ask. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We do not presume upon God by asking too much. We insult him by asking too little. We insult him by asking too little. Are you willing to ask him? Are you willing to come and say, Jesus, will you? 'Cause I don't know what the answer will be. I don't know what his answer will be, but I know we can have a great time finding out together. I don't know what the answer will be, yes, no, maybe later, whatever. I don't know what the answer will be, but here's what I know. I know that I have seen God resurrect dead marriages. I have seen him destroy addiction. I've seen him abolish shame. I have seen him take people's guilt and tell their guilt to go to hell and remove it. I've seen him save the craziest of sinners and the most hardened religious people. I've seen him heal people's sicknesses and ailments and cancers and backs and knees and all kinds of things. And I've seen him comfort the brokenhearted and mend broken hearts and wipe away tears. I've seen it happen. I couldn't predict it. It wasn't dependent on whether or not I was praying right, whether or not my faith was strong enough, whether or not that person really believed right enough or had their theology well, or if they had their life in order, if they've been to church the last week or not. It was based on the sheer sovereignty and mercy and grace and love of Jesus. That's the only basis there is. And so, are you willing to ask him?